Mondays always smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink. That morning was no different. The office lights buzzed faintly overhead as I stepped into the elevator, adjusting the cuff of my navy blazer, pressed, practical, too stiff for my mood. My heels clicked softly against the floor, echoing through the sterile silence. A folder tucked beneath my arm held the work I'd spent the last 3 months on: branding strategy, full market analysis, campaign rollout timelines. A blueprint for success. For our success. As the elevator opened to the executive floor, I caught my reflection in the chrome panels. Tired eyes, lipstick fading, a small coffee stain I hadn't noticed on my blouse. I wiped at it uselessly. My nerves buzzed, but I told myself, "You've done this before. You've earned your place here." The conference room sat like a glass fishbowl at the end of the corridor, sleek and modern, cold and unforgiving. Inside, Darren sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, a half-smile playing on his lips, as he scrolled through something on his phone. Marla leaned over his shoulder, whispering something that made them both laugh. They didn't look up when I entered. A few junior execs filtered in. The room filled with that dry murmur of pre-meeting. Small talk, coffee orders, weekend plans, passive-aggressive banter about deadlines. I found my seat, placed the folder in front of me, and tried not to notice the way Marla's eyes flicked toward it and then away, dismissively. "Let's get started," Darren said finally, without glancing my way. I waited for the nod that usually meant I could present. It didn't come. Instead, Marla launched into a summary of a campaign direction that was mine. She'd renamed it, butchered the theme, stripped it of nuance, and made no mention of where it originated. I blinked, once, twice, waiting for Darren to correct her. He didn't. He nodded along, even interrupted once to enhance an idea that was already in the original plan, my plan. I cleared my throat. I think it's worth noting that the original strategy outline included. Marla cut me off with a smile so sweet it burned. "We're going a different direction, hun. Something a bit more aligned with the executive vision." A few people chuckled, unsure, uncomfortable. I felt the heat rush up my neck. Darren gave me that familiar, patronizing half-smirk. "Let's not get bogged down in technicalities," he said. "This is a collaborative space." Collaborative. That word, sharp as glass in my mouth. I tried again, voice tighter this time. "I spent months on this. I've met with vendors, negotiated rates. This isn't just a concept, it's a fully built strategy." Marla raised an eyebrow. "Well, maybe next time loop us in before running wild with ideas." "Running wild?" I echoed, stunned. I looked at Darren. "Is that how you see it?" He hesitated, just for a breath. And in that pause, I saw everything I needed. He looked at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. "It's not personal," he said, voice calm, calculated. "But we need solutions that match where we're headed. This isn't quite there." The words landed like a slap. I felt the walls closing in, the hum of the lights too loud, the air too thin. I glanced at my folder, still unopened, sitting there like a relic. The ring on my finger glinted under the fluorescent bulbs. I turned it with my thumb. Around and around. I had stayed up past midnight for weeks perfecting this. I'd missed dinners, skipped sleep. Given everything I had to this company, to them. I had built it with them from scratch. And now I was being erased. One of the interns made a comment about how wives in leadership often created interesting dynamics. Laughter. And Darren laughed too, not loudly. Just a soft exhale, amused. Like I was a joke he didn't want to admit to. Something inside me cracked. Don't remember how the meeting ended. I remember the scrape of my chair against the floor as I stood. the silence that followed, the heat burning behind my eyes. I walked out without my folder, left it there like a corpse. As I stepped into the hallway, the tears didn't fall. Not yet. Instead, I kept walking, past the glass walls, past the reception desk, out into the brittle November air. Cold wind slapped my cheeks. It felt cleaner out there, like truth. I didn't go home. Not right away. I sat in my car with the engine off, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. That woman, she looked tired, small, dimmed, like she'd been dimming herself for years and hadn't noticed until the light was completely gone. I thought about the first time Darren told me I was the smartest person he knew. I thought about how I believed him. About how I'd folded myself smaller, quieter, more agreeable, just to make his shine seem brighter. About how love had slowly turned into utility. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just been overlooked. I had been replaced. Not with someone new, but with silence, with obedience, with invisibility. And maybe, just maybe, that was the plan all along. We met in the fluorescent-lit basement of the university's entrepreneurship lab, surrounded by half-empty Red Bull cans and whiteboards scribbled with dreams. Darren was all fire, fast-talking, fast-moving, the kind of man who made you feel like you were standing still just watching him. I was the girl who carried a highlighter in her back pocket and color-coded notes for fun. He said I made him feel calm. Like an anchor, he told me once, brushing hair from my face as if he couldn't believe I'd looked twice at him. And maybe he was right. I was calm, reliable. I liked order and plans, and he was chaos wrapped in charm. I thought we balanced each other. He proposed on a rooftop after he landed his first client for a freelance project. A family friend, a small cafe chain. It wasn't grand or expensive, but he got down on one knee with shaking hands and a cracked voice. I remember thinking, this is what building a life looks like. From the ground up, together. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner and turned the spare room into an office. We'd sit side by side at night, laptops open, sharing lukewarm takeout and trading ideas. When the firm officially launched 2 years later, I quit my job in corporate branding and poured everything into our business. No salary, no title, just belief. At the time, it didn't feel like I was giving anything up. It felt like devotion. It felt like trust. Then came Marla. She arrived one stormy April night, suitcase in one hand, broken heart in the other. Her marriage had ended in a financial catastrophe, and Darren, ever the hero, told her she could stay with us until she got back on her feet. He didn't ask. He informed me, already moving her things into our guest room. I told myself, it's just temporary. Family takes care of family. At first, I welcomed her. I offered her my clothes, shared recipes, even rearranged our schedule to help her feel included. But Marla had a way of filling a room so thoroughly, it left no air for anyone else. She inserted herself into client calls, criticized design choices she didn't understand, started hosting office happy hours I wasn't invited to, and Darren? He encouraged it. She's finally getting her confidence back, he'd say. Don't be so territorial. I wasn't being territorial. I was being erased. Still, I stayed quiet. I played the understanding wife. The mature one. The glue. I didn't push back when my ideas were funneled through Darren's mouth and presented as his. I didn't argue when Marla was listed as creative director on a campaign I'd spent weeks developing. I convinced myself that credit didn't matter if we were all winning, if he was winning. But the cracks started forming. I remember one night, late, when I stood in front of our bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, and caught Darren watching me from the doorway. Not lovingly, not like before. More like studying a stranger. His eyes lingered on the little lines near my mouth, the loose t-shirt I slept in, And when I smiled, trying to bridge the distance, he just turned and left. I still don't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it was the first time I realized something inside him had shifted, and I had no idea when it happened. Over time, I learned to shrink in quiet ways. I stopped speaking up in meetings when Marla rolled her eyes. I stopped asking Darren how his day went because his answers became curt, distracted, filtered through his phone. I began existing like a ghost in my own life, haunting spaces I had once filled. The wedding ring on my finger became a habit more than a symbol. I used to twist it when I was nervous. Now I twisted it all the time, as if I could tighten it enough to keep everything from slipping through my fingers. Sometimes I'd lie awake at night and listen to them talking downstairs. Marla's voice bright, Darren's laughter easy. I told myself I was being paranoid, insecure. My friends, at least the ones still in my life, had dropped subtle comments, asked if I was okay. One even joked that I'd become the silent partner in more ways than one. I smiled. I deflected, because if I admitted what I was starting to see, I didn't know who I would be without this life. Without him. Love, I thought, meant sacrifice. My mother had given up everything for my father. Her job, her passions, even her name. I'd watched her do it with pride, and I thought I was honoring her by doing the same. But now, years later, I see it more clearly. Wasn't a partner. I was a backstage crew member holding up the spotlight while they performed. The house we lived in was full of photos. Darren shaking hands, Marla with her designer bags, smiling in sun-drenched office spaces. And somewhere in the background, always blurry or cropped out, was me, a shoulder, a silhouette. Proof that I existed, but only just. I didn't complain. Not out loud. But silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes silence is where betrayal breeds best. It didn't end in the conference room. If anything, that moment was just the beginning of a slow and precise unraveling, like someone tugging at the hem of a garment I didn't realize was already falling apart. After the quarterly meeting, Darren barely looked at me. His emails stopped, including me on internal threads. Projects I had initiated, nurtured, and built from scratch were reassigned without warning. My name vanished from planning documents and team boards. When I asked about it, he waved a hand dismissively and muttered something about realignment and efficiency. Marla was suddenly everywhere, her laugh echoing through the office, her name splashed across new decks, even the interns mimicking her manicured tone. She wore clothes I recognized from our closet. Mine. I borrowed it, she'd say, her voice syrupy, daring me to argue. One day she wore a perfume Darren had bought me for our anniversary, the one he said smelled like our first kiss. I hadn't worn it in weeks. I couldn't even remember why. No one said it aloud, but the shift was clear. I was being cleared out like furniture no longer in season. At home, the silence was louder than any shouting match could have been. Darren and I moved through the house, like strangers in a hotel lobby. Polite nods, half smiles, no eye contact. He started traveling more. Client expansion, he said. His phone screen turned always just a little too far from my view. The home office became his fortress. He'd lock the door when he took calls, but the walls in our house were old, thin. Sometimes I could hear his voice, smooth, confident, rehearsed. And then Marla's laugh, that brittle, false note like broken glass trying to sing. One evening, I brought him a cup of coffee. Habit, muscle memory, something my hands did while my heart flailed, and paused outside the door. And then I heard it. Marla's voice, clear on speaker. She still thinks she matters, you know. A snort of laughter. Darren's. She's just comfortable, not clever. The firm's outgrown her. Well, she did her part. Now it's time for her to bow out gracefully. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I stood there with that cup cooling in my hand, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard, hoping somehow I'd misunderstood. But the truth had a tone, and I knew it. I had been listening to it for months. My hand trembled so hard I almost dropped the cup. I turned to steady myself, and my eyes landed on the hallway wall, on the framed photo from our wedding day. I reached for it, without thinking, pulling it down from its nail like I needed to hold something solid, something that could prove I hadn't made this all up, that I had existed, that once we had loved each other. But even the glass was dusty. I hadn't noticed how long it had sat untouched. I waited. I stood there in the hallway holding that photo like a mourner with an urn, waiting for the door to open, for Darren to come out and explain, lie, anything. He didn't. He opened the door only when I knocked, lightly, too lightly, like I was afraid to make waves in a house I once helped pay for. He looked at the coffee in my hand and blinked. What? I didn't know how to start. I didn't know where my voice had gone. I heard you, I said finally. Quiet. I heard what you said about me. He didn't even flinch. Oh, that. He stepped around me and headed to the kitchen like we were discussing the weather. You took that out of context. Really? My voice cracked. What context is that? The one where I built this business with you from scratch and now you mock me behind closed doors? He sighed. Actually sighed. Like I was the one being unreasonable. You've lost your edge, he said. Not cruelly, just plainly. Like it was a fact. You don't understand where the market's going anymore. Marla and I, we're evolving the brand. You're sentimental, slow to adapt. I stared at him. I saw the outline of the man I married, but none of the weight behind his eyes. None of the warmth. Just distance and dismissal. I gave everything to you, I whispered. To us. I walked away from a career. I fought for you when no one else believed in you. And I'm grateful, he said, reaching for a glass of water. I am. But things change. People change. But vows don't, I said. He looked at me then, really looked. But there was no sorrow in his gaze, only calculation. You're making this harder than it needs to be. That was when something broke. Not loudly, not like shattered glass, but quiet, like a final stitch snapping in fabric stretched too thin. He turned away, and I collapsed, right there in the hallway. The photo frame slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. I followed it. My knees hit hardwood, my body folded, and I cried. Not the kind of cry you can hide behind tissue and careful sobs. No, this was raw, heaving, snot-slicked grief. The kind that clawed up from deep inside, from places I didn't know had been hurting this long. I buried my face in my hands and felt the heat of shame, of betrayal, of years wasted on someone who saw me as furniture. Background, a stepping stone. And yet, even as I wept, something else stirred. It was faint, like the first stirrings of muscle memory after numbness, but it was there. A voice. I am not a ghost. I had given and given and given until I became a shadow, flickering at the edge of someone else's success story. But shadows remember light. And I remembered who I was before him. The ring on my finger felt heavier than ever. A symbol that had once meant love, and now just meant quiet surrender. I slid it off. It left an indentation, pale skin shaped like a circle, a mark of where I had been holding on too long. I wiped my face, sat on the floor, until my breathing slowed, until the cold wood beneath me felt like ground again. And then I stood up. I walked into the bedroom, stripped off the sweater I'd been wearing. His sweater, his scent still lingering faintly in the sleeves, and tossed it into the laundry basket like I was shedding a skin that no longer fit. I stood in front of the mirror, red-eyed, raw, but upright. Not a ghost. Not anymore. I left at dawn. No drama, no tears, no second thoughts. Just a single suitcase packed in the soft hush of morning, and a note on the kitchen counter. Short, neat, final. I didn't even sign it with my name. Just I'm done. Because that was all that needed saying. The road north unspooled like ribbon beneath my tires, each mile a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. 4 hours and change. That's how long it took to reach the cottage my grandmother left me. A lopsided little house tucked behind rows of trembling birch and the lake, which looked like spilled ink under the pale sky. I hadn't been there in years. The gravel drive crunched beneath my wheels like it was surprised to see me. When I stepped inside, the air smelled of dust, cedar, and old stories. The kind that cling to floorboards and curtain seams. The wallpaper peeled at the edges. The floor creaked in protest. The kitchen faucet moaned when I turned it. But it was mine. I didn't unpack right away. I dropped my suitcase in the entryway and stood there, frozen, unsure whether I'd run away or come home. That first week I barely moved. I slept, long, heavy stretches of dreamless nothing. I ate in silence, reheated soups and toast with butter. My phone stayed off. I didn't miss the noise. Grief came in waves, unexpected, sharp. I'd open a drawer and find a floral tea towel that reminded me of my grandmother and cry. I'd see my own reflection and wonder who the tired, hollow-eyed woman staring back was. But the quiet didn't scare me. Not anymore. Silence had always been my prison with Darren. Here, it became my sanctuary. On the 5th day, I found the old clock. It was sitting on the mantel, still and silent, its hands frozen at 3:47. I remembered winding it as a girl, the way the gears would tick and spring to life. I took it down, dusted off the grime, and opened the back panel. Inside, something glinted, a tiny photograph. Me, age 10, with Grandma, both of us smiling, wind-blown, barefoot by the lake. Behind it, a note in her looping cursive. "You are stronger than anyone knows, especially you." I cried then, but not like before. These tears were quiet, reverent, something sacred. I began to fix things, not just the clock, which I coaxed back to ticking life with a bit of oil and patience, but everything. I scrubbed the counters, aired the blankets, sanded the porch railing. Each small repair felt like a stitch in a torn seam. A way to remind myself that I still had hands, that I could create instead of collapse. In the evenings, I walked the woods. Trails worn from childhood summers stretched before me like old friends. The trees whispered truths the city had drowned out, that I was still here, still real, still mine. I found my grandmother's old journals in a drawer beside the bed. Yellowed pages filled with musings, recipes, pressed wildflowers, grief, joy, longing. I started one of my own, each entry like pouring my soul through ink. I wrote about Darren, about Marla, about the way love, when weaponized, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. And slowly, patterns emerged. Darren's charm had always been a leash, his praise a currency. He had fed me compliments only to keep me docile, small. "You're the only one who really gets me," he used to say, as if I were a reflection of him, not a person. And Marla? Her insults were sugar-coated. "You're so good at the boring stuff. You'd be lost in high-level strategy. Thank God you're not too ambitious." Every dig wrapped in a laugh or a side hug. I used to smile and shrug. Now I saw the rot. They hadn't changed. They had simply revealed themselves. One afternoon, I wandered into town to buy groceries and ended up walking past a small community center, a cheerful building with peeling paint and paper flyers taped to the windows. That's where I met Nora. She was stacking folding chairs when I stepped inside, her arms lean with muscle, her hair cut short and defiant. "You knew?" she asked without looking up. "Old," I replied. "Just returned," she smirked. "That's the best kind of new." Nora ran the place. On Saturdays, she taught self-defense classes, something she'd picked up during her bad years, she said with a wink. I showed up for a class, then another. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She had the look of someone who had already survived herself. During breaks, she told stories about the women who found power through punch pads and elbow strikes, about healing not as a destination, but a muscle you had to train. With Nora, I didn't have to explain the look in my eyes. She saw it and nodded like it was a shared language. "You don't have to fight him," she said once. "You just have to stop surrendering to his version of you." That line stayed with me. Back at the cottage, I opened my laptop again. Not to scroll, not to seek, just to work. Real work. I accepted a small consulting gig for a rebranding campaign. Then another. Word spread, slowly, carefully. No LinkedIn announcements, no glowing reviews, just quiet, clean output. Turns out I hadn't lost my edge. It had just been buried, beneath obligation, silence, and the need to please people who never clapped for me unless they were taking credit. Every finished project gave me back a piece of myself. I started dressing for myself again. Soft knits, wool socks, no makeup unless I felt like it. I wore a pair of silver earrings my grandmother once gave me. Tiny crescent moons. They made me feel like I belonged to something older, wiser, inevitable. The cottage transformed. Not all at once, but enough. I replaced the curtains, painted the porch, planted herbs by the window. It wasn't about aesthetic. It was about claiming space again, about saying, I exist here, fully, without apology. And the clock on the mantel? It ticked now, steady, measured, just like my breath. They thought I would vanish. They thought I would shrivel into silence and shame, dissolve into the background like I always had. Just a ghost wife with good manners and no sharp edges. But the truth is, I didn't vanish. I became. It started small, like most revolutions do. A Gmail account under my maiden name, Carter, not Duval. The name I used before Darren rewrote my identity into an extension of his ambition. I opened a quiet LLC and called it Carter & Co. Simple, elegant, anonymous, and then I built. In the same way I used to fix the clocks and seams at the cottage, I crafted a new business from scratch. Branding, messaging, identity strategy. I'd always been the invisible architect behind Darren's success. Now, I became my own client. I crafted my voice, my aesthetic, a brand consultancy for women-led startups and socially conscious ventures. And people noticed. My first client was a vegan skincare line run by a woman who reminded me of Nora. Sharp, kind, and entirely unafraid. The second was a nonprofit in the city that had heard whispers about the quiet genius in the north. Soon, the work rolled in, fast and clean and honest. Within 5 months, I had more revenue, reach, and creative fulfillment than I ever had at Darren's firm. But this wasn't revenge. Not at first. It was reclamation. A resurrection of the woman I'd once been, before I was loved into silence. And as I worked, I kept coming across fragments, emails, project briefs, pitch decks I had written, now repackaged under Marla's name. They hadn't even changed the formatting, the fonts. My fingerprints were all over them. And then there were the finances. I hadn't looked at them in months. But one rainy evening, I logged into the shared accounting platform Darren had forgotten to remove me from. Perhaps he assumed I wouldn't know how to read it. Perhaps he thought I was too busy being broken. I wasn't. And what I saw made my skin crawl, shell accounts. Payments routed through third-party contractors who didn't exist. Loans taken out against my name, my signature forged or leveraged without my consent. Darren had kept me as a co-signer on high-risk real estate ventures, ones with ballooning interest rates and offshore leaks. If they failed, I would be held liable. If they succeeded, I'd be erased from the profit line. Marla, too, had her fingerprints on falsified invoices. She billed the firm for consulting hours on my projects, ones I'd written, pitched, and nurtured into six-figure contracts. They hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. They had legally and financially stripped me of credit, ownership, and protection. That night, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat beside it with a notebook open in my lap. I documented everything, every email, every discrepancy, every slight. I filed backups in cloud storage, created printouts, made a spreadsheet that mapped the slow theft of my legacy. And still, I did not rage. I planned. Because power is never in the shout. It's in the whisper that makes everyone lean in. One of my newer clients was a venture capitalist, one of the old guard, refined and razor-sharp, with an instinct for talent. He had invested early in Darren's firm years ago, before pulling out due to misaligned ethics. I asked him over coffee what that meant. He smiled. "Darren's smart," he said, "but he plays dirty, and short-term." I told him about Carter & Co., told him what I was building. He raised an eyebrow. "You built them too," he said. "Didn't you?" I didn't nod. I didn't need to. 2 weeks later, I submitted an application for a board position at Darren's company. The investor, now a client and ally, had recently acquired a significant stake. With his endorsement, my name landed on the internal short list. They didn't even recognize it. My maiden name, my new company, my new face, sharper now, with steel behind the eyes. I wore the earrings my grandmother gave me to the first board meeting, silver crescents, small but bright. Like a warning moon, Darren's face when I walked in was something I will never forget. Panic, disbelief, then that hollow arrogance he always used to mask fear. "Claire," he said, rising halfway. What are you doing here?" I smiled, soft and polite. "Good to see you, Darren." Marla looked like she had swallowed vinegar. She wore a tight black suit I'd seen her copy from my old wardrobe. The irony made me want to laugh. The meeting began. I spoke last. And when I did, I didn't flinch. I walked the room through a case study. My own. My projects. My contributions. My authorship, documented and dated and legally sound. I showed the inconsistencies in Marla's billing, the forged approvals, the shell accounts. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room shifted around me, silent and alert. When I finished, I said, "This company was built with my labor and my silence, but I am silent no longer." Darren tried to spin it. He called it a miscommunication. Marla muttered something about process inefficiencies, but it was too late. I wasn't looking for vindication. I was reclaiming narrative. Over the next month, I took meetings, attended sessions, spoke only when I had something worth saying, and I always did. I didn't need to destroy them. They were doing that just fine on their own. But I made sure to take back what was mine. Quietly. Thoroughly. One day I walked into my old office, the one they had given to Marla when I left, and found it empty. A new assistant had boxed up the contents and labeled it for Carter. I opened the box. Inside were old project folders, a photograph of me and Darren at our first gala, him in a tuxedo, me in a navy silk dress with a crack in my smile. At the bottom was a bottle of perfume I hadn't worn in years, amber and rose and something bittersweet. It still smelled like the woman I used to be. I left the photo behind, but I took the perfume. Later that evening, I sat by the lake again, back at the cottage. I wore the perfume, not for him, but for me. I watched the clock tick steadily on the mantel, and I realized they never expected me to rise. But I didn't just rise. I rebuilt. And this time, I built something no one could take. The boardroom hadn't changed. Same floor-to-ceiling glass, same austere walnut table stretching like a runway of power, same carefully curated art on the walls pretending to mean something. But I had changed. I wasn't the woman who once sat 3 seats from the end, trying not to make too much noise. I sat at the head now. My chair didn't creak under me like it used to. I no longer fidgeted, no longer shrank to fit into corners built by other people. My pen was aligned with the notepad in front of me, my hair pinned back, my breath steady. I was not here to plead. Darren walked in 5 minutes late. Classic. Always needed the room to feel him arrive. But his confidence faltered when he saw me. His eyes widened, only slightly, but enough. He looked at me like I was someone he almost recognized but couldn't quite place. Not his wife. Not the woman he cheated on. Not the one he erased. Someone else entirely. Marla followed behind him. She wore her armor, tight dress, red lipstick, phone in hand like a weapon. She glanced at me, smirked, then caught sight of the man sitting beside me. Arthur Levesque, majority shareholder now, and very much not on her side. The smirk disappeared. "Let's get started," I said calmly. No flourish, no venom, just clarity, like pulling a thorn from skin. The meeting began with formalities, financial reports, projections, buzzwords thrown like paper planes. But I didn't listen. I watched. Their nervous glances. The way Darren tapped his finger against his coffee cup. The way Marla's voice pitched just slightly too high when talking about vision. Then I set down the folder. Thick, cream-colored, with tabs and dividers. Inside, the audit, the evidence, every wire transfer from the shell accounts, every forged signature, every duplicated project brief with metadata, tying back to my original files, every billable hour that never existed, every contract stamped with my name, then conveniently stripped of it in public records. I passed the folder across the table. Arthur opened it, slowly, methodically, and the room changed. Air left lungs, spine straightened. Darren swallowed. Marla, stilled like a statue made of panic. I didn't need to narrate the crimes. The numbers spoke louder than outrage ever could. Arthur closed the file, turned to the others in the room, legal counsel, silent shareholders, an HR director who once told me I had a tone problem, and said, "Motion to remove Darren and Marla from all executive functions effective immediately, pending legal review and criminal investigation." I looked at Darren. He looked like he had aged in the last 5 minutes. "This is insane," he said, voice cracking under forced calm. "Claire, we can talk about this." "I'm not here to talk," I said, rising to my feet. "You once told me I didn't understand the game, that I was just comfortable, not clever." Marla scoffed, but it sounded weak, hollow. I looked at her. "You stole my work. You wore my voice like a borrowed coat. You thought if you smiled while cutting me down, I wouldn't notice the blood." The room was silent. "Turns out," I continued, "I helped build this board. I know its bones. And now, you answer to me." Arthur didn't blink. "All in favor?" Hands rose, all but 2. Darren and Marla's, and just like that it was done. They were no longer part of the company. The empire they built on my silence was no longer theirs to rule. I didn't stay for the aftermath. I had no interest in watching them flail, scramble, beg. Their chaos was not mine to carry anymore. I walked out of the room, down the elevator, out into the cool breath of evening, the city humming like a distant lullaby. Back at the cottage, I opened the closet that still held remnants of the life I left behind. The wedding photo. It had followed me here. I had tucked it in a drawer once, unsure why I hadn't thrown it out. Maybe I needed to be ready. Maybe closure requires ceremony. I took it out and studied it. Darren and I, frozen in time. My dress white and simple. His tie crooked. My smile, unsure. A moment that used to feel sacred now just looked staged. I carried it to the fireplace, lit the match, held the flame just beneath the corner. It curled like a ribbon, blackened edges giving way to orange, then gold, then nothing. The photo disintegrated into ash. I felt no need to cry, just release. Then I found the perfume, the one he always bought me, year after year, like clockwork, as if I was a habit, as if love could be bought and sprayed on. I carried the bottle to the lake, unscrewed the cap, poured the golden liquid into the water, watched it ripple out like silk. It wasn't rage, it wasn't regret, it was baptism. The house we once shared, sold, a clean transfer. I took my share and never looked back. Now I speak, at women's business forums, university panels, small startup events and large conferences. I teach strategy, yes, but more than that, I tell my story. Not the polished version, the real one. The story of being overlooked, then overpowered, then slowly reclaiming my breath. I host workshops for women rebuilding after betrayal. Not just romantic betrayal, but corporate, creative, familial. The kind of betrayal that makes you forget your own shape. At one of those events, a young woman asked me, "When did you know you were done grieving?" I smiled gently and said, "When I stopped needing to be understood. When I realized closure isn't a door slamming shut, it's the quiet certainty of walking through a new one." She nodded, wrote that down, and I thought, maybe that's the legacy. Not revenge, not headlines or courtroom drama, but truth and the power of choosing yourself. Every morning now, I wear the silver crescent earrings, not because they're flashy, not because anyone notices, but because I do. They're the first thing I put on. A symbol, a reminder, a promise. I am not the woman you left behind. I am the woman who left you behind and never looked back. The end.